Tragically, I lost my son, Ben, to a fentanyl overdose. It was the hardest thing I had ever had to endure. It's happening across Canada. Fentanyl is wiping out an entire generation of our people. So we started a foundation, Guardians of Recovery, to help people with mental health and addictions who are struggling and not included in society. We've done a great job of including people with disabilities in our society. Now imagine a world where people with mental health and addictions have that same level of inclusion. That's what we're about to do. We are inviting you to take part in one of the most progressive and creative initiatives of our time, building sober living homes for our people to make sure they are cared for and have an opportunity to completely come off substance and live normal, productive lives.
Well, hello, everyone. Normally we're broadcasting in the evening, but today we're at right at noon here in Newfoundland. I'm Tina Olivero, your host for Guardians of Recovery, most fondly known as Ben's mom. As you know, I lost my son to a fentanyl overdose. And instead of really focusing on all that negativity, we're trying to find solutions, create an environment where we create a future that is safer for our kids. And today I'm super excited to let you know that we have a special guest, David Best, with us. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Tina.
So David is the professor or the director of the Center for Addiction Recovery Research at Leeds Trinity University in Leeds, UK. And we're most interested in picking your brain and finding out all about, well, first of all, how you became the world's first professor of addiction recovery. And also, most recently, as we spoke, you were doing some work in West Virginia, launching the first recovery city there. So what I'm hoping to accomplish, our intention today, is for you to educate us and share with us by, first of all, telling us what a sober, inclusive recovery city is, and then we'll launch into your work and your endeavors. How's that sound?
Perfect. So first, thank you so much for inviting me on. One of the things that I think is a big change when you go from a disease addiction treatment model to a recovery model is you switch from trying to manage and measure deficits to trying to build strengths. And fundamentally, lots of those strengths are social. So there's two very simple ways of describing recovery. One is jobs, friends, and houses. The second is somewhere to live, someone to love, and something to do. Right. And in essence, they are the golden threads that go through all of recovery research. Mm-hmm. What that means is that if we want to think about not just individual pathways to recovery, but how you create the conditions where people can recover, they are things to do with social networks and communities that are about overcoming stigma, creating pathways to community resources, preventing barriers that stop people from seeking help. And in essence, an inclusive recovery city is an attempt to celebrate the achievements of recovery, but in doing so to give back to society and give back to communities and contribute. That when we did our Life in Recovery survey here in the UK in 2015, we found that for people who managed to be 5 years in continuous sobriety, 74% of them were in full-time work, and 79% of them actively volunteered in their own communities. And there's a crucially important message here. Yeah. That if we can maximize the chances that people get to that 5 years of continuous sobriety, they will pay society back and more by their work, their volunteering. And one of the things that's just a fundamental part of so many people's recovery, which is their willingness to go that extra yard, to give back, to help out. And that's such an important part of our Inclusive Recovery Cities, which is an initiative, a global initiative, that's around trying to say, let's not think of be nice to people with addiction who are trying to recover.
Right.
But create opportunities for them to contribute and give back to communities. And that's really what the initiative is about.
Right. So this survey really proved that people who are working and volunteering have a sense of purpose of work, contribution. Those are the factors that lead to long-term recovery.
Absolutely. And look, the UK survey is one of two that I've led. I've led the surveys in the UK and in Australia. But there are also surveys in Canada, in the United States, that show exactly the same things. And just a couple of facts for you, Tina. The first one is, the first is a fact, that of all the people who have a lifetime substance use disorder, 58% will eventually achieve stable recovery, which is 5 years of continuous abstinence. So recovery is not possible. Recovery is probable. More people will recover. It takes a long time, but more people will recover than don't. And there's a wonderful acronym that comes from the mental health recovery field called CHIME. And CHIME stands for Connections, Hope, Identity, Meaning, and Empowerment. And if we want to help people recover, having support services that achieve those 5 goals, those 5 component parts, is massively important in that process. And it all starts with human connection.
Right. Let's say those again. So chime is the structure, and what do they stand for?
Connection is the C.
Connection.
And positive social connection generates hope, which is the H.
Yeah.
That change is possible. And that then creates a virtue, or allows the conditions for a virtuous circle of identity change, meaning and purpose in life, and empowerment. And that becomes a cyclical process of people who develop a sense of purpose and meaning, develop a positive identity, and feel empowered and enriched in the capability of moving forward.
It just seems like such basic common sense. I mean, those are the fundamentals that we all want and need. But it seems like society, as it stands right now, is contrary to that. It's like, when we have a society where we have people living on the streets and in tents and not cared for and have all kinds of mental health issues as well, it is the complete opposite of that.
Absolutely. And one of the challenges is there's almost a kind of social contract. If we say to people, look, because you've been an addict, we're not going to let you do certain jobs. We're not going to let you live in certain places. We're not going to let you go to college in certain places. In fact, we don't really want you in our libraries, and we don't really want you on our buses or our trains or in the following civic institutions. Effectively, what you do is you exclude, you ostracize, and you make choices about recovery less attractive to people. And people will simply get, and in terms of crime, this is sometimes called the pains of desistance, that people make the effort to change, but nobody accepts that they've changed, and they almost get forced back into where they came from because society effectively blocks their pathways to recovery. And for me, the whole idea of inclusive recovery cities is to do really 3 things: to challenge those stigmatizing values, to create pathways to opportunity for people at whatever stage of their recovery journey, and then by doing both of those things, to afford people the chance in recovery to contribute to the well-being of their community. And as you rightly pointed out, connection is not something unique to the recovery community for mental health or addiction. Isolation is a massive challenge for society now. And it seems to me that the whole idea of this is really to say some of the lessons from recovery should be applied generally across communities.
Yeah. As like inclusive communities all together are everybody's included. These things apply to all of us. And if we just kind of architect our towns and cities around these parameters, we should be doing a whole lot better with whether it's a mental illness or whether it's an addiction or whether it's dementia or doesn't matter what it is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the whole idea of the inclusive recovery cities model is precisely based on that. It's about increasing what we call collective efficacy, the willingness for groups and communities to support each other and to connect with each other, which we know leads to things like less juvenile offending and lower crime rates, which are massively important in terms of the well-being of communities.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the biggest challenges that I hear is people who have recovered say, oh, because lots of times people, they don't break the law, they don't lie, they go into addiction, they do break the law, there's a lot of lies and everything that go, and they come out in recovery and they're not doing that again. And it's often very clear pattern, only just the time when they're in active addiction are they doing these things because of the level of the addiction. But they're stuck with a criminal record and can't get a job and can't be included in society. And they're having difficulty to, as you say, get back in and find a place. So it really does my heart good to hear that inclusive cities, recovery cities are popping up around the world. I think I read somewhere there's about 100 of them so far.
Not so far. We have about 30 so far. But if they grow at the current rate, we will have 100 by next year.
Okay, I'm not sure where I read that, but yeah, it definitely said that these recovery centers were popping up. And I see from some research that I did with you and Dot Smith that you guys are working together on initiatives there. Can you tell us? I saw the video that they had from their group, their community in the UK. So what's happening there?
Yeah, so this is such an impressive success story, and Dot has done an incredible job in bringing together the recovery community. So this is set in Middlesbrough, which is a post-industrial city in the northeast of England, which was identified as having among the highest levels of social problems anywhere in England. So high rates of crime, high rates of drug use, high rates of drug-related death. And over a period of about 5 or 6 years, a series of recovery initiatives, which we're calling BRIM, Building Recovery in Middlesbrough, has included a recovery florist and flower shop called Blooms, a recovery cafe and restaurant called Fork in the Road.
Yeah,
and it's just there's a food van, there's a Fork Academy to teach people cooking skills, there's a recovery community centre that's a drop-in. We're moving towards there being a little village or campus for recovery in Middlesbrough. And it really has been an incredibly inspiring model. And to some extent in Britain, it has led the way with inclusive recovery cities. So about 10 months ago, we had our formal launch event in Middlesbrough at the football stadium. And really the initiative, the whole movement has sprung from that. And it's been incredibly impressive. And the group of people that Dot has gathered around her, so the staff of Recovery Connections, virtually every single one of them is in recovery themselves. Between them, they have more than 300 years of recovery time. So wow. They are like visible role models. They are the kind of icons of success and change for the recovery community. And it's been a phenomenally exciting and successful project. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges with recovery is you can't simply duplicate it and put it down somewhere else, what we call McDonaldizing. You can't just say, right, it's worked in Middlesbrough, so we'll take what we've done in Middlesbrough and transplant it to another city in the UK or the US. You have to work with what the innovations and the assets and the resources are in the place you're working. So you can take the principles, but you can't take the practice because it's so contingent on the who and the what you already have in your communities.
Right. Yeah. So every recovery village, if you will, is like a custom version, but it runs on a basic fundamental foundation that you then kind of create whatever resources you have around you. So speaking of resources, this sounds to me like it has to have buy-in from all levels of government, municipality. Like, how does that work? Because right now, our current government, our current systems are not even listening to what is needed in terms of rehab and detox, let alone create a recovery village. I mean, personally, I think this is the way through. When I think about a recovery village, when I think about what my son needed then, that's what he needed. He needed a community of people in recovery. Like, he didn't want to just stay home with me and be completely isolated and not use. He had no connection with his peers. He had no purpose of work. He had, like, to me, it was like being in another form of jail. So there was no environment for him that he could see himself in, that he said, that's me, that's where I fit.
Yep. So look, I mean, I did a study in Melbourne in Australia about 10 years ago now, where we looked at a group of young people who were coming through a specialist treatment for youth with addiction problems. And after they left treatment, we monitored where they went to. And young people who went back to the same social groups and social networks, they pretty much universally relapsed. They went back to offending and they went back to substance using. Right. There were a group of young people who managed to stay away from their networks, but they isolated. They locked themselves at home, or they went into apartments and did the same. And they had lower relapse rates, but they had appalling mental health problems and appalling social functioning issues. Right. It was only the group of people who managed to maintain the same size of social network, but transition from network supportive of addiction to network supportive of recovery. They were the people who did really well. Yeah. One of the purposes of our models, including the Inclusive Recovery Cities model, is to help people make those kind of transitions, to transition from using groups to group supportive of recovery. And it's where things like recovery community organizations, 12-step groups, and all of those innovative things, recovery fishing clubs, recovery football teams, they really matter. And for me, you know, one of the things that we have focused a lot of work on is something called recovery capital. What is the sum of resources somebody has available to them to support their recovery journey? And we're now switching that lens. We're not switching, we're adding to that lens by saying, how does that apply in families? What does family recovery capital look like so that the whole family has the potential to recover from the trauma of addiction?
That's amazing. I mean, as it stands right now, I did a show on parents and grandparents with addicted loved ones last night. And part of our organization, Guardians of Recovery, has a program specifically for families with addicted loved ones. But really, the orientation of our culture is not even talking about that. So it's kind of like families are being decimated across Canada, where we are right now, because of illicit drugs. The number one cause of death between ages of 10 and 19 is illicit drugs in our country. And that means there's massive fallout in all of our homes and our families across the nation. And it's barely spoken about. So it just gives me so much hope when I think that globally things are starting to change.
Well, and for me, you know, one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that my training as a psychologist, my background is as a psychologist, and I trained and worked in a large teaching hospital in London for years. And the problem with the traditional symptom-based model is it's bleak and it's pessimistic.
Yeah.
So we start from the assumption that virtually nobody gets any better. Why? Because the people we see are people who either never leave our services or who are in a revolving door in and out of them. And then we hear terrible stories of people who've died. Well, if you go from a different perspective and you start from the recovery community, you realize, but people do recover.
Yeah.
And the process of engaging people is not through more talking therapies or medications. It's about providing people with role models, with mentors and guides and like peer supporters who can help people to find meaningful activities, work, training, education, and support people on that journey through a process of fundamental kind of warm human connection where there's a sense of if you can do it, I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
So that social learning model is central to the recovery approach. And what it means is that where those crucial changes happen aren't in health clinics, they are in the community and in the presence of peers who've already been down that road. So that kind of experiential learning, that lived experience is so important in transmitting these messages of success. And that also goes for families. That goes for families as much as it does for individuals with their own addiction problems.
It so does, because the distinction, David, that it can be done, it is possible. I've already done it. Here, I'll show you how. I'm just an ordinary person who got through the exact same thing as you did. And then when you have 100 of those people, 200 of those people,
Absolutely.
You have a cafe, you have you have a shop, you have a village. These are all roads lead to recovery and proving that it's possible. You have an infrastructure that is saying, here's where we overcome this. We're not going to adapt those old models of thinking. We're not going to give this illness limitations. People recover all the time. As you say, more people recover than don't. And here's the real life action of that taking place. But it starts with the architecture of the infrastructure of that little recovery village, starting
Absolutely.
the place where, like, if I was in recovery, where would I want to go? I would want to go sit in a coffee shop where other people were going through the same thing. I would want to be able to go to 12-step programs or recovery programs, or be with like-minded people, engaging in the arts, for example, just as a way of life. Like for me personally, I don't use drugs or alcohol just by choice, personally. And I would love to go to a place where there was all kinds of people who don't use drugs and alcohol. I just think it would be the coolest thing ever. I think it would be great if we had bars that were alcohol-free, events
we do in one of our other recovery cities in the UK, Nottingham. There is a recovery cafe called Cafe Sobar, and it's fabulous because it's in the city centre, in the middle of the nighttime economy, and it's used by people in recovery. So they host 12-step meetings and smart recovery meetings, but it's also used by people who want to go to a place on a Friday or Saturday night where they don't have to deal with drink or drugs, where they don't have to deal with the after effects of violence and dealing and all those kind of things, because they know it's a safe, sober space to be. And that's such an important message to say, this should be you shouldn't have to stay at home just because you're in recovery or because you don't want to be surrounded by alcohol or drugs. And I think for me, a big part of what we're trying to do is to get that message across to say, well, there are places like this. And it doesn't mean you can't have any fun or it's going to be just miserable for you. That these are attractive places that offer that safety and that sense to be around like-minded people.
Yeah, because often I hear people say, when I do drugs, it makes me feel more like myself. But you can walk into an environment that makes you feel more like yourself, a sober environment that is allowing you to feel more like yourself, because that actually is who you are. Who you are is not yourself covered up with drugs. Who you are is yourself as a sober person in other environments that you didn't traditionally fit into the status quo, but here's an environment that you fit in perfectly with. And
I think one of the things that is commonly said about the onset of addiction is that people are highly susceptible to addiction if they've suffered from early life trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And I think there's strong evidence supporting that hypothesis. But instead of saying we have to try and treat those things, treat the trauma, treat the addiction, recovery capital is very similar to post-traumatic growth, that they share lots of qualities about having a sense of identity, having a sense of belonging, feeling some sense of meaning and purpose in life. They are shared things about post-traumatic growth with addiction recovery. And it's so important that the journey can be a pull to a better place as much as a push from a bad place.
Exactly. And yeah, so you can share experiences. And then there's also, like in our family, it genetically hit all the, most of the males across the board in our family, my brother, my son, my cousins. And so, that in itself too, where there's a lot of people with that genetic predisposition running through families, decimating families, those are all shared experiences. And we have a lot of people tuning in, interested in your conversation. And that says the stigma of being an addict, even though you are in recovery, is absolutely holding our loved ones with addiction back. Employers are not wanting to give someone in recovery a chance. Indeed, exactly, which is why we have to change this whole thing around.
Absolutely. Change the narrative significantly. Now, there are research studies that say people who are in stable recovery and long-term recovery have better records of workforce attendance and better records of workforce achievement than the general public. Because typically when people come through the other end of such a difficult journey and a miserable process, they are very committed. And we also see it in education that when people resume college courses after they start their recovery journeys, their outcomes are generally really good because they have a very strong sense of mission, frequently with a very strong sense of who they are, that makes those journeys possible. So yeah, I think part of overcoming that barrier of stigma is about increased awareness and increased public acceptance and recognition of recovery. But there's also a sense for me about saying, well, we will only do that by actively and visibly contributing to the community.
Yeah. Now, I think it would be so cool if companies got behind this and had a stamp, like an ISO certification that said, I'm a recovery employer. Like I'm an inclusive recovery employer as a standard of being a good, not only a good corporate citizen, an inclusive company. We have all kinds of structures in place for inclusivity when it comes to disability. We need that same level of commitment.
Now, there are examples of this that exist already. So in the United States, in New Hampshire, they have an initiative called Recovery Friendly Workplaces that's partly based on this model. Sorry, could you just excuse me a second?
Yeah, no problem. Got to answer the door. For anybody watching, if you have any questions for David, now is the chance while we have him here to talk about recovery, cities, recovery villages, recovery infrastructure, employment with companies. Yes.
I'm really sorry. There was just somebody at the door. I had to go and answer my front door because I'm home alone at the moment. So my apologies for that. And in the UK, in the area of gambling, we have something called the Workplace Charter, which is a wonderful initiative that has been developed by colleagues of mine at Beacon Counselling Trust, which has two objectives. One is to raise awareness among employers about gambling, the signs of problem gambling. But then when people are identified as having gambling problems, there are pathways to recovery-oriented help and support. And this is such an important model because what it means is it acts as a form of prevention as well as an early intervention. You don't lose valued employees this way. And it seems to me that the workplace is a very, very good place to start targeting, both for getting people back into work, because we know that when people do get back into work, their likelihood of relapse reduces.
Yeah.
That, you know, as I said at the start, the fundamental things that support recovery are a safe place to live that's free from threat, a sense of meaning and purpose about your day, and positive social connections that are supportive of your recovery journey.
Yeah. Now, here in Canada, we have a lot of camps, and the camps have been infiltrated with drugs. And so there's a lot of addiction. I see this as a huge opportunity for those large corporations that have those camps to be able to turn it around and make the camps recovery camps and inclusive camps.
Absolutely. And look, we're already seeing this in college campuses. So there is a wonderful initiative called the Collegiate Recovery Programs, where the idea is that on university campuses, you will have sober dorms, you will have sober safe spaces for people in recovery. And in Middlesbrough, where you mentioned earlier, as a wonderful part of that program, they'll go out with a coffee bike and they'll say to students, if you'll talk to us about recovery for 10 minutes, we'll give you a really good cup of coffee. And the idea there is a very innovative way of taking recovery out, making it visible, making it acceptable, and showing people that there are successful icons of recovery.
Yes, absolutely. Addiction thrives in the dark. As soon as we normalize the conversations, just like any other thing, that any other challenge we have to deal with. I'm so hopeful. This is definitely one of those most hopeful conversations. A Facebook person says it's inspiring and hopeful to hear you speak about the possibilities. Having support systems in place would be instrumental in successful recovery. Absolutely, indeed. These are the things we need to do here in Canada as well. Everyone needs a safe place to live and a purpose in life. I love the idea of sober spaces. So, David, can you tell us now, last time I got in touch with you, you were in West Virginia launching the first recovery city there, I believe. Can you tell us about, like, how do you actually, because I'm interested in doing that here. How does one do that?
Perfect. So essentially there are basically two types of requirement. So the first one is that you have the support of recovery grassroots organizations, that fundamentally this has to be a community-led initiative.
Right.
But you also need the buy-in of at least one treatment service or provider to make sure that it doesn't become a kind of alternative to treatment. So it is a genuine system. And you need the buy-in of some governmental or policy organization that will sign up strategically to supporting the process. And then the second thing is you have to be able to hold 4 recovery celebration events at least each year. 4 public-facing events that contributes to the local civic calendar and that showcases or celebrates aspects of recovery life and recovery activity. And ideally, they will be open and inclusive to any excluded or marginalized group. But in essence, what you are doing is showing the contribution that recovery makes to different communities. So in the UK, this has included things like we have a recovery Olympics called the Recovery Games that's held once a year, where more than 1,000 people come from all over the country to take part in a sporting festival, and people bring their children and bring their partners and their parents. And it's a genuine celebration of well-being after addiction. And these things are so important. They are so important because effectively they do this. Now, going back 14 years now, I was lucky enough to host or be one of the hosts of the second UK Recovery Walk, which was in my home city of Glasgow in Scotland. And we had, I think, about 1,500 to 2,000 people take part in the Recovery Walk. And why do you do these things? Well, there are a number of reasons. One, just to celebrate the achievement of recovery. Two, to bring people in recovery together to build those positive social connections. 3, to show to people still struggling with addiction, recovery is possible and this is what it looks like. It's happy, it's social, it's connected, and it's realistic. 4, to challenge any general public stereotypes and negative expectations about recovery. 5, and we had the then community minister from the Scottish government open the walk and take part in it. So the fifth thing is about political influence. The sixth is to say, we want our communities to be lively, vibrant, open and accessible places. So the recovery community has as much and no more responsibility than any other group to contribute to just civic connectedness. So those are the reasons why you would have those kind of events. And effectively, all of them are to try and primarily challenge stigma, create pathways to new opportunities, networks, and resources for people in recovery, and to make your community a better place for everyone who lives in it. Because we know, the other thing that for me is crucial about this, the more visible and attractive recovery is, the more likely people are to seek help earlier.
For sure. I want to design recovery resorts because Newfoundland is one of the most scenic, beautiful places in the world. Clean air, clean water, icebergs going past your doorstep. It's just the best hiking in the world. And I think, imagine having recovery resorts all littered all over Newfoundland and Labrador. It is such a unique thing. People would come from all over the world.
Yeah, and look, where I live is the same. I live in the Peak District, which is the oldest national park in the UK, and it's absolutely beautiful. It'd be a perfect place for a recovery resort. And you know, for me, this is exactly that model that says, well, if you have a model of treatment where, and when I worked in treatment services years ago, people would say, look, if only the client had come 2 or 3 years ago, before they get into not just their drug problems, but they've got AIDS, they've got hepatitis, they've got co-occurring mental health problems, their body is significantly depleted by addiction, they've got a long criminal record. But if you have treatment that is delivered in a passive way in specialist centres, which are highly stigmatized and only really deal with the symptoms, nobody wants to go there until it's a matter of absolute last resort. If you engage people in a recovery discussion by having dance festivals and sober social evenings and comedy nights and recovery walks and recovery fetes and festivals and markets, then you're opening the door at a much earlier point in the journey to people to say, how do I get involved in this? And so effectively at that point, recovery becomes a form of both prevention and early intervention.
So pardon me. Yes.
Sorry, all I was going to say was I see there's another quote or comment from somebody. How can we incorporate this into schools with our teens? Well, it seems to me that the adult recovery movement is really about saying we make discussions about addiction and recovery more accessible, more attractive earlier on. We effectively to challenge the visibility of drugs and addiction. Now, there are recovery high school movements where recovery has been successfully shown to influence recovery pathways in school-age children. There's a very successful collegiate recovery model that has flourished significantly in the last 10 years or so. For me, there is both direct targeting, but really the whole point of the Inclusive Recovery Cities model is to change the conditions to make it more accessible to people generally.
It makes so much sense. So let me recap. If we decided that we wanted to have a recovery village here in Newfoundland, we would include an organization that's already involved, like NA, for example. We would also incorporate a partner with the treatment center that's already running. We would get the government involved, whether it was municipal or provincial, and we would have 4 events in the run of a year that were celebrating public events. And that's kind of the criteria for becoming
the only other thing we would ask you to do is we'd ask you to join our national and international groups to share innovation, to share ideas, and to exchange just the goodwill and success that people experience with this. That sense of championing and celebrating success is fundamental to this approach.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'm going to do is take a copy of this show today and send it to our, our people at the municipal level, provincial, and our federal level to see if we can start talking about these. I think recovery villages is just would be the coolest thing. I think about
Absolutely.
art, music. I think, like you say, dance festivals, recovery Olympics. I think about walks, runs, and all kinds of things.
And one of the things about this that people are so creative. So where I work in Leeds, there's a fabulous recovery social enterprise that's called Getting Clean. And what does Getting Clean do? They make soap. They make soap and sell it in marketplaces. So what a wonderful idea. So a great name for a recovery organization and a great name for a soap making organization. And they call it Soap with Hope. So the idea and the world is just full of these incredibly exciting, innovative things. And, this is where people can't get jobs. So what's their solution to not being able to get a job? Set up your own business, be creative, be active and dynamic, and do things that make a contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the West Virginia initiative, is there anything new or different that they're doing there? Like what's your role in helping them?
We've had some problems with West Virginia, and we've stalled a little bit with West Virginia. But in essence, let me just tell you about the fabulous services that are there. We have and I see you've got a comment about a recovery Olympics. In Florida last year, they had recovery Nerf gun wars, where people teams in recovery took part in like competition with Nerf guns. But yeah, let me tell you about the wonderful services. So there are a series of women's recovery residences in Beckley in West Virginia called Seed Sower. But when women go into these recovery residences, and typically they'll either be coming from treatment or homelessness services or from jail, when they go in, they have to sign up to agree to train as bakers. And they work in one of 4 bakeries across West Virginia called Fruits of Labor. And Fruits of Labor has been so successful, populated entirely by people in recovery, that they've ended up buying their own farm to make their own produce. And this is a wonderful example of people early in recovery get recovery-related jobs that contributes to the community, that creates that sense of dignity and pride. So while the Inclusive Recovery City activity has slightly slowed down in West Virginia, the underpinning model has been incredibly successful.
Mm-hmm. So what you're doing is architecting like 360 economies where they're symbiotic and they support each other and one leads into the next, and then you build a whole entire culture. Makes all the sense in the world. Some great ideas, and the actual Olympics are superb. The bakery idea is wicked. People are loving these ideas. All of these ideas are amazing. Thank you so much for doing this interview. I think what it's doing is kind of waking people up to the possibility of all the different things that we could be up to. And if there's one thing that we are here on this island of Newfoundland, it is beyond creative, because we have been defined by our barriers of water. So we've had to be creative, and we've had to make things work in the toughest of circumstances. So these things look like massive opportunities to us. I wanted to ask a question for those people who are looking at getting into the field of recovery and addiction recovery. You're the world's first professor of addiction recovery. How does that happen? What would you need to do if you wanted to become a professor of addiction recovery?
Well, for me, I have basically dedicated and worked for 30 years as in both traditional addiction treatment settings, and then more recently, I have collected about 3,500 recovery stories in Scotland, England, Wales, Canada, Australia, America, New Zealand, and essentially, I've written extensively about the science of recovery. So my kind of academic credentials have really been to say things that we know about recovery, can we evidence them? But I would also say, as much as anything else, I am a recovery activist. I am not a desk-bound or a lab-bound university academic. My
Mhm.
work is consistently in the field and engaging with recovery groups, recovery communities, and promoting and championing recovery. I wouldn't regard myself in any way as some kind of neutral, objective scientist. My
Right.
job is effectively to champion recovery and to find out what works in recovery.
Boots on the ground, get your hands into it and make
Absolutely.
change happen, because that's exactly what we need around the globe. So, of the 30 cities that are popping up, what's the most exciting thing that sort of bubbles up to you that says, okay, here's the future?
Well, look, I think there's two things, if you don't mind me answering in two ways. The
Sure.
first is in an area that's had huge problems, ethnic issues, and since the war has had various socioeconomic issues. 14 of our inclusive recovery cities are in the Balkan region. So between Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Croatia, we've
In-
seen incredible kind of flourishing. And the next city that we hope to bring along, and this is the second point I want to make, is Cape Town in South Africa, where I think for me, this idea of the aim of this model is based on the notion that recovery is contagious. And for me, the exciting thing about recovery cities is that hope is contagious and that connection is contagious. And
Mhm.
that what we're trying to do is to use the model of addiction recovery to make communities stronger, to make the connections in communities stronger, not just for people in recovery, though that's the primary goal, but for everyone. For
Yeah,
everyone, because everyone's lives are touched to some extent by addictions.
yeah, every single person, absolutely. If you don't have an addiction, someone in your family has an addiction, and at some level, everybody has an addiction, whether it's life threatening or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So a question here from Rose says, why can't people with addiction issues who are going to be incarcerated be sent to a recovery place to get help instead of going to jail? That's a very powerful question.
And to some extent, it happens. It doesn't happen anywhere near as much as it should do. So, one of the places that I've been working in recently is in Virginia, in Richmond, in Virginia.
Mhm.
And there's a wonderful prison based therapeutic community called HARP, Helping Addicts Recover program. And people go receive peer based intervention support in prison, in jail, and then go straight from there into recovery residences. And from those recovery residences, they access work. And we've had tremendous success with this. And it seems to me that if you're serious about rehabilitation and criminal justice, you have to find diversion points into recovery support and peer-based support almost at every step of the way, at the point of arrest, at the point of court and conviction, in
Yeah.
jail and following release from jail. I
Mhm.
think for me, one of the challenges has been that the models of delivery, we know there's lots of exciting and innovative things, but fundamentally criminal justice models are not necessarily particularly supportive of recovery journeys. And
No.
the outcomes will be much better. So even from deeply conservative people, if your concern is about reducing the burden on the state and society, people who achieve and sustain long-term recovery through strength-based initiatives will contribute much, much more in the long term. The other thing we know is that if parents achieve sustainable recovery, their children have better school attendance, school engagement, and matters what happens with the children of addicts. And recovery can break the intergenerational transmission of addiction. And that's a
Yeah,
really important message.
it is. That's huge. And also I don't know, think we've actually done a good job of tallying up the cost savings of recovery. But if we did that globally, considering the number of people who are currently suffering with addiction, that would be a very helpful number to know for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're such an interesting character, David. I could sit here and pick your brain all day, but our show is coming to an end shortly. I guess, at the end of the day, we want to my goal with Guardians of Recovery, I just lost my son last summer, and all I could think about was what did Ben need in order to succeed? And for me, it was sober living homes, sober cultures, sober, like you said, like having a recovery village. I just love that term. And recovery resorts where there is this level of inclusion and people feel this is my home. This is where I belong. They're my people. And I know I can now see my future in a positive way. And if I don't, there's infrastructure to help me. My last question to you is, where does early diagnosis come into all of this? Because for my son, Ben, he had like a form of anosognosia, no cause and effect. He didn't recognize that he was sick, and which happens to many bipolar and schizophrenia patients that then go on to have addictions. So how do we deal with this?
So look, in terms of the diagnosis question, for me, I think the medical model has been fundamentally flawed and overstated. I think it's much more important, rather than focusing on diagnostic medical interventions, to focus on inclusion, to focus on meaning and purpose, and giving people now, which is not to undermine or diminish the fact there are going to be people who are going to need not only medical interventions for addiction, but also medical interventions for co-occurring disorders like personality disorders, neurocognitive functioning, psychiatric health problems. But the fundamental difference with a recovery model is we do not want people getting mired in specialist medicalized treatment centers. We want people engaged in community activities with peers, engaging in the solutions in the communities they live in. And for far too long, I worked in settings where people just didn't really get better. They got an awful lot of medicines and medications, but it didn't really help a great deal. They were part of a system, an industrialization of addiction. Yeah. The models of treatment are too often processing people. They don't do enough to provide that empathy and hope and relationships that are fundamental to give people that sense of, here is my future and here's where I'm going.
Yeah, so your message is loud and clear. It's inclusion into a systemic support system where people, are part of that whole system that's supporting them. And yeah, this is where I belong. That's absolutely the bottom line on the whole.
This is where I belong, and we want to welcome everybody else into where I belong as well.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, fantastic. Did you have anything else you wanted to say or anything?
No, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time.
You've been a phenomenal guest. I can't wait to have another show with you sometime, and hopefully I'll be able to get Dot to join us as well.
Perfect.
So if you're speaking to her, give her a nudge and say you've got to get on Tina.
I will.
Share your knowledge with all of us. So you may be hearing from me when it comes to sober recovery village, and we're moving mountains over here at a very, very rapid rate. So someone says, please come to Newfoundland. Awesome show. Thank you so much.
I will be in Calgary in Alberta at the start in 2 weeks for the Recovery Capital Conference. But I will send you some of the materials around inclusive recovery cities, and feel free to distribute them.
That would be fantastic. Okay, well,
thank you so much. Take care.
It's super talking to you. Can't wait to do it again.
Thanks very much, Tina. Take care. Bye.
Tragically, I lost my son, Ben, to a fentanyl overdose. It was the hardest thing I had ever had to endure. It's happening across Canada. Fentanyl is wiping out an entire generation of our people. So we started a foundation, Guardians of Recovery, to help people with mental health and addictions who are struggling and not included in society. We've done a great job of including people with disabilities in our society. Now imagine a world where people with mental health and addictions have that same level of inclusion. That's what we're about to do. We are inviting you to take part in one of the most progressive and creative initiatives of our time, building sober living homes for our people to make sure they are cared for and have an opportunity to completely come off substance and live normal, productive lives.